Hello.
Peter Sellers was an explosive mixture of talent, ambition, and contradiction.
You have a ring? A ring? What?
This comic genius spent the majority of his time on screen making us laugh.
Oh, really?
In a career that spanned 5 decades, he was many different people, but never himself.
God knows who that is anyways.
His meteoric rise from relative obscurity to film superstardom was nothing short of phenomenal.
This story is no idle fiction.
That is just how it was.
His most inspired and beloved creation, Inspector Clouseau, sent the world into hysterics. But there's a lot more to his story. Much more.
Tell me about myself, would you?
He left behind a large body of work, lost and forgotten pieces of film that have rarely been seen, or have never been seen even by his most devoted fans. This, then, is the unknown Peter Sellers.
Oh, you've seen him on the telly. How'd you do?
The people who say that Peter Sellers' comic flair amounted to genius are probably absolutely right.
He was so brilliant at things. I mean, he could do anything. I said to him one day, you could even do a murder, get away with it.
He was a true emotional artist. He could paint strokes that just dazzled you.
The great thing about Sellers, he could play almost any character he wanted to play. He could just sort of slip into a role.
He was a star, and he will be a star when some of the so-called stars of the present day who are lauded as greats will be forgotten.
There are other geniuses, but there's really only one Peter Sellers.
His creative journey took him from young, chubby, aspiring performer to comic genius. For nearly a decade, he was one of the biggest movie stars in the world. But by the early 1970s, his career was virtually over. His films had made hundreds of millions, but he was almost broke. Once the most in-demand actor in films, now he didn't know where his next job was coming from. By 1973, he was reduced to making television commercials to earn a living. How had it come to this? How had one of the funniest men alive sunk so low? Peter Sellers began his show business career unexpectedly at the ripe old age of 2 weeks. His parents were stage performers, and one night in September of 1925, the star of their show brought the baby on stage and said, "Let's all wish him well." Baby Peter burst into tears, and the audience roared. It would not be the last time he'd make people laugh. Peter was raised in a world of adults, with few friends his own age. He began observing the show people around him and mimicking their voices and dialects. With his unmatched ability to reproduce what he heard, this lonely boy was able to turn the spotlight back on himself.
When Peter was aged about 14, he was as tall as a boy of 16 or 17, so he stuck out like a sore thumb. And whenever you are prominent in that unacceptable kind of way in class, you do all kinds of things to make sure that the rest of the class likes you. And one of the ways that Peter got the attention of the class and got them laughing was to imitate the people that he heard around him.
The discovery that he could get somewhere by impersonating other people made a profound impact on Peter, one that would ultimately bring him more attention than he ever dreamed possible. In 1943, when he turned 18, Peter joined the Royal Air Force. Although unable to fly due to poor eyesight, the RAF found a better way to exploit his talents.
The first time I met Peter, I was transferred from the Royal Air Force, the real Royal Air Force, into what was called the gang shows, the entertainment unit. And there was a rather fat-faced boy with a lot of curly hair, and he was a fine drummer. He played with big bands. As an 18-year-old, he was the star of the show. But he was still doing impressions off, but wasn't doing them on because we had an impressionist.
And he used to put on the uniforms that they traveled with and impersonate officers. It was great for Peter to go around into the sergeant's mess and visit the men pretending to be an officer, for which he could have got a dishonorable discharge and probably a prison sentence. That kind of impersonation was irresistible to him.
After the war, believing that his voice would be his fortune, Peter worked holiday camps and small theaters playing the drums and doing impressions. All too often, he was booed off the stage. Desperately wanting to break into radio, Peter made his way to London, but the only work he got was doing impressions at the Windmill Theatre, a glorified strip club. One night, a BBC talent scout was in the audience and booked Peter on New to You, a TV show featuring amateur talent. Videotape had not yet been invented, so Peter bought a disc-cutting machine to make a sound recording of what would be an historic moment, the birth of his broadcasting career.
I'm glad you've heard my name. It's Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers can be gay as well as zealous. And now it's my due from the program New to You, as one of Britain's up-and-coming fellas, perhaps.
At this point, there was nothing special about Peter's act, and no one took notice. Still unable to get work in radio, in a moment born of desperation, Sellers took fate into his own hands.
He got his first job on radio through telephoning and pretending to be a BBC producer. And said, I've just seen this young man, Peter Sellers, he's wonderful. He does impersonations that are fantastic, and you really must book him for one of our shows. We've got to have this young man before somebody snaps him up.
The producer was totally fooled by Sellers' impersonation until Peter's nerve gave out and he revealed the truth. Impressed by Sellers' courage and talent, the producer booked him on Showtime, a top radio variety show.
Show business is forecasting a big future for him, so let's have an extra special welcome for Peter Sellers.
After just this one appearance, 22-year-old Peter Sellers was suddenly in demand. During the next 2 years, he was heard on more than 250 radio broadcasts, displaying a formidable repertoire of funny voices. Sellers was still getting ahead by not being himself, but his ambitions extended far beyond radio.
He's got the spondulics. Spondulics? A dreadful disease. Oh, Major, the spondulics in the fingers. Oh, the worst place you can have it. It travels straight up the brain and crumbles the arm. No. It travels up the arm and crumbles the brain. Yes.
You're looking at Peter Sellers' very first appearance on film. Penny Points to Paradise was a low-budget comedy, produced quickly and even more quickly forgotten. It hasn't been seen since its original release.
Madam, this is a bathroom and not a confounded beehive.
It was an awful film.
Madam, this is a bathroom and not a nursery.
Sellers would keep trying to make it in the movies, but real stardom would come on the radio when he teamed up with Spike Milligan and Harry Seacombe.
The established comedy was getting a bit frayed at the edges during the war. If it was the same thing, they did the same catchphrases and they told stories about, I say, if anything happened to me on the way to the theatre, all that sort of thing happened. And we wanted to change that because we were anarchists. We wanted to break the mold and start again.
On March 28, 1951, listeners to BBC Radio were subjected to a harrowing experience that would change the face of comedy forever.
Stop those carefully rehearsed and written ad-libs and proceed with your task of announcing radio's answer to TV.
Namely, the original lantern slide type wireless goon show.
You might not realise it, but it was skating pretty near the edge, you know, of humour.
Here, take that. Oh. Hey, Ben.
There had never been that form of anarchic humour before.
I'm terribly sorry to knock you up so late.
They all say that.
The thing about the Goon Show was it wasn't actually jokes that you told, it was just magical little moments.
Do you mind if I take a gander around the shop?
No, as long as it's house-trained.
It's carrying a gag to its illogical conclusion. That's what Goon Show was. It was essentially an oral cartoon.
Moriarty, how many times have I told you not to drive that leather omnibus round the bedroom in broad daylight? You know these blinds are drawn, they're not real.
Spike Milligan wrote most of them, but of course Peter was an absolute central force in terms of the performance and the voices.
Sellers played many characters on the show, making each one instantly recognizable. There was Major Dennis Bloodknock, a devout coward prone to severe gastric imbalance.
Oh, no more curried eggs for me.
Hercules Gritpipe Thin, the ultimate con man.
Allow us to introduce ourselves. My card.
But it's blank.
Business is bad.
But perhaps Sellers' most popular character was Bluebottle, a self-styled juvenile hero with a strange, high-pitched voice.
I heard you call me my captain. I heard my captain called me. Wait for audience applause, not a sausage.
He'd physically change. As he did the voice, he'd change. He'd sort of blow himself out for Major Blooddock. And then he'd shrink for Crun, and then he'd get very small for hello, my good man, for Bluebottle.
It's the front door.
The Goon Shows didn't attempt to make any sense.
I'm waiting for the medical inspection.
Oh, I reckon you need one, mate.
The influence of the Goon Show on me was the fact that when it came to Python, when we could write whatever we wanted to write, the material I was doing and the characters I was sort of thinking about very much influenced by Milligan and Sellers.
The Goons became part of the British national consciousness, beloved by commoners and royalty alike. After a 9-year run as the most popular radio comedy show in England, while still on top, they decided to call it quits. The Goon Show made Peter Sellers famous, and until the day he died, he would always call those days the happiest of his life.
Yes, that was it. The last of them, so bye now.
In the 1950s, he was a major success on the air, but Sellers still struggled to make it on the big screen. The only work he could get was in films designed to capitalize on his Goon Show success. His talent for portraying multiple characters was on display in Let's Go Crazy, a short film that has not been seen since its release in 1951.
Another thing, do you serve crabs here?
Yes, sir.
And serve my friend. He hasn't eaten for 3 weeks.
Thank you.
I'll give him as a personal present to you.
Oh, I'll take him home for supper.
Don't do that. He's had supper. Take him to a show.
Just a minute, sir.
Don't talk to me like that, son. Don't talk to me like that. Don't like your tone of voice.
How old are you, sir?
68.
How old?
69.
You just said 68.
I know. It took me a long time to get around there.
But his characterizations were still based on funny voices. He had not yet learned how to play a whole character, how to invest it with a rich inner life. British movie makers considered Sellers to be nothing more than a vocal talent. So to advance his film career, Peter made another bold move.
In this film you are about to see, we bring you the true story behind Britain's super secret service.
Sellers produced and starred in a short film spoofing British spies. This print from his private collection is the only one left in the world.
You there. Have you got anything to say?
Yes.
Anything else?
No.
Any evidence?
Yes, sir. This is the gun that killed Legs Monaghan.
Arrested at once. No. One moment. This is a water pistol.
I know, sir. He was drowned.
Sellers' craft as a film actor was improving, and Britain's most legendary studio took notice. In 1955, Sellers was cast in a small role in his first major motion picture opposite his idol, Alec Guinness.
Peter wanted to be another Alec Guinness. Peter felt that mimicry was fine. He could do that. But to be a straight actor, as he knew Guinness could do, that was Peter's goal.
The Ladykillers was a big hit, but despite strong notices, still no other film offers came his way. So once again, Sellers decided to make his own break. The spark was ignited in December of 1955 when he happened to watch a TV special starring a young American.
The next morning, I had a phone call. And a voice said, "You don't know me, but I saw your show last night." And either that was the worst show that British television has so far produced, or I think you're on to something. I said, "Well, do I have a choice?" And that man was Peter Sellers. So we met, kicked around some ideas. We decided that we would do the TV version of the Goon Shows.
The series was called Idiot Weekly, priced tuppence, and the first of 6 shows was broadcast live on February 24th, 1956. It was a modest success and proved to be a warm-up for a second series, a show called Fred.
There was a real sort of sense of excitement about a show called Fred.
The first letter tonight is from Africa.
Broadcast live, it was fast and frenzied, and in the first 10 minutes, Sellers and Lester, along with Spike Milligan, broke every convention of respectable comedy. These films have been locked away, unseen, for over 40 years.
Lost in the woods, lost in the woods. Nothing but trees, and I am lost in the woods.
Sacre, it's Monte Carlo.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
The Count of Monte Carlo.
The one thing that we did try to do was to push the rather narrow bounds of television comedy. And certainly Spike and Peter were anxious not to fall into those traps and to produce material which was as visually anarchic and stimulating as their verbal work had been.
A groom. Ah, there you are, groom. Take these horses and water them.
A show called Fred was 30 minutes of weekly lunacy, surreal, irreverent, and extremely disrespectful. It was praised by critics for creating a revolutionary form of television comedy that owed nothing to radio or the music hall. Peter Sellers had become Britain's newest and most original television star.
Well, now, first, good news for housewives. Here's something you'll find an invaluable aid when out shopping. Yes, it's money, the new wonder currency. Why don't you get some today?
Poor little hairy titch. Getting out of his mind. He thinks I want to marry him. I, who've been promised to Brigadier Dial, MC. There, my little wounded bird. I'll tame your wild blood.
Whether driving a 4-poster bed as if it were a car, or as a doctor about to amputate his own nose, Sellers demonstrated an impressive range of characterizations. And while movie producers debated how best to utilize his talents, Sellers put aside his funny voices to experiment with pure physical comedy in the long-lost Cold Comfort. In 1957, Sellers finally got what he'd always dreamed of, a starring role in a feature film. In The Naked Truth, he played a TV star who disguises himself as 5 other characters. An extraordinary performer was starting to emerge.
My name's Lanigan. I'm from across the water. You'll be O'Toole, and it's right glad that I am to meet you. Well, why are we talking in the cursed tongue when we have the Gaelic? Oh, Chlan fair with Gingith, go Gaelic wind with, Chlan Tassilio, go, go, go.
It's an Englishman, all right.
Most reviewers thought he stole the show.
My nose.
But in his next project, there wouldn't be anyone's thunder to steal but his own. By 1959, Peter Sellers' work as a character actor had earned him the respect of the British film industry. With his next movie, he accepted a triple challenge that would make him a star.
The Mouse That Roared. Starring an hilarious new personality, Peter Sellers, in 3 gloriously funny roles. Peter Sellers as the noble statesman.
There isn't a more profitable undertaking for any country than to declare war on the United States and to be defeated.
Peter Sellers as the fearless leader.
Men of Fenwick, when you hear the name of Grand Fenwick, do your hearts swell with pride?
Yes!
And if your country calls, will you rush to enlist?
No!
Oh.
Peter Sellers as the Grand Duchess.
Do give my love to your president, will you? And Mrs. Coolidge, too.
The Mouse That Roared. His first starring role was a modest success in England. But in 1960, when the film slipped quietly into New York, it stayed for 7 months, setting new box office records for a British film in America. Hollywood moguls descended with offers of work in California, but not yet confident in his own abilities, Sellers turned them down. It proved to be a wise choice, as he would soon rocket to the top of the British entertainment scene.
I first became aware of Peter Sellers, the screen performer, at the end of the 50s, and in fact met him there, on the set of I'm All Right, Jack. John Bolting, the director of the film, had invited me down to watch the film being made, and I stood by John and I said, well, where is Sellers? And he said, standing right beside you. And I looked round and I saw this guy, who was Fred Kite, the union organizer. And I said, you're Peter Sellers? And that was the greatest tribute, in fact, I could have paid him, because Peter believed that if you couldn't recognize him through the makeup, then he was getting close to the character.
I'm obliged to point out, Major, that if you sack this man, the company is in breach of its agreement with the union.
Surely he's not a union member.
Correct, but that is merely technical.
But didn't you say that he was incompetent and couldn't do his job properly?
We do not and cannot accept the principle that incompetence justifies dismissal. That is victimization. That's right.
As Fred Kite, Sellers played it straight, never overtly trying to be funny. For his subtle and inspired performance, Sellers won the British Academy Award, beating out Laurence Olivier, Richard Burton, and Peter Finch. Sellers was on the verge of international stardom. But before that would happen, he spent 2 Sundays in a field with some friends and nearly won an Oscar. Most people have never heard of the running, jumping, and standing still film, much less seen it. But this 11-minute short would not only get Peter Sellers an Oscar nomination, but would lead to Richard Lester being hired to direct the classic Beatles film, A Hard Day's Night.
The genesis of Running, Jumping, Standing Still, I think, was Peter loved toys, and he bought himself what was then the latest camera, and he wanted to try it out.
It surprised me that it got the notice, but I always thought it was very funny. I mean, it's still funny. It's stolen from Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd. I mean, that's... If you think Monty Python stole from the Goons, just look at what the Goons stole from Keaton.
So here we are with this 70-pound film, which we really had no serious intent to do anything except a fairly elaborate home movie to try out the machine. We were now Academy Award nominees.
The Running, Jumping, and Standing Still film did not win an Oscar, but Sellers had already thrown himself into an intense period of movie making.
Peter worked in overdrive. He never stopped. He had a fear that was not uncommon among actors, that if he did stop, it would all stop, and he wouldn't be able to get back in the swing of things.
Those trays get stuck. Just stab that underneath the trays and they'll come loose all right. Well, what are you waiting for? Start stabbing.
In his next film, Sellers added improvisation to his screen talents.
Thank you. Oh, and this.
The highlight of Battle of the Sexes, an attempted murder, was largely made up on the set.
That goes in here. So you're a secret drinker, eh? Well, well. Still Waters, that's your name from now on. Say when. Don't you ever say when?
No.
Say, you weren't kidding when you said that about drinking. Come on, Still Waters.
By 1960, Sellers was able to pick and choose the movies he wanted to make. Tired of what he called little man comedies, Sellers decided to try something completely different, and the results shocked his fans.
But Alfie, I told you never to lift anything within 5 miles around here.
Never Let Go was a film that Peter wanted to make, and everyone else tried to dissuade him from making it.
He played, the only time, I think, in his whole career, a real, absolute, if I may use the expression, bastard. I mean, really.
Pick it up, Tony. Your shoes. You see, they never learn. They all think they know better than I do. But you've only got to look at them and look at me, haven't you?
I've got a legitimate business here, Tommy. I've got nearly 200 account customers. Why? Because I've learned that money makes money, Tommy boy. Never do anything silly and you could be all right.
The movie fell utterly flat. It was Peter's first reversal, and it put him off playing unsympathetic characters, I think, forever. He realized that he could suffer, he could be hurt.
Sellers' next film, The Millionaires, paired him with Sophia Loren. The on-screen chemistry between them was sizzling, but the film did only lukewarm business at the box office. However, it gave Sellers a taste of what it was like to be a romantic leading man, and he liked it a lot. He embarked on a series of crash diets and exercise programs designed to transform a plump actor into a slender, charismatic movie star.
All I can say is that it did surprise us that this little fat jolly fellow that we knew in the mid-50s was altered in such an extraordinary way.
Peter Sellers? Yes, Peter Sellers, as the greatest lover in Aberdassie and discoverer of a few new rules of gamesmanship. Versatile Peter Sellers displays a new talent as the would-be playboy with only one game in mind.
What is it? It's Vernon. What? Get out of bed quickly.
Even when he was being the romantic lead, you knew that sooner or later a bucket would fall on him. And we all waited for that to happen.
Surprise.
And this is where the fun really begins.
He was a supreme character actor. There was nothing he couldn't do, except make love to a girl. And
Sellers endeared himself to audiences by playing a bumbling romantic, and his physical comedy unknowingly laid the foundation for his first American movie and his most famous character.
We must find that woman.
Well, no one knew the Pink Panther was going to be the hit it was. Even Peter didn't.
What was that, what you say?
Peter wasn't supposed to be in the film at all. It was supposed to be another Peter, Peter Ustinov.
Peter Ustinov backed out just days before shooting was to begin in Rome. Director Blake Edwards made frantic calls, searching for a replacement. After seeing 2 of Peter's films, Edwards cast him immediately.
But when Peter was asked to play the part of the bumbling French detective, and he was flying from London to Rome, he had no idea how he was going to play it. And he thought about it as he went. Now, Peter nearly always got the voice first. That's how he started his characters. But on this occasion, he was lighting his cigar with a box of matches that had a character called Captain Webb. It was a man in a striped swimsuit, old-fashioned, with a large moustache. Peter said, "That moustache looks fairly good to me. Well, Clouseau might wear that." And then he'd bought himself that very morning a new Burberry trench coat. And he said, "Well, yeah, Humphrey Bogart, I used to imitate him to get the girls. They loved my imitations of Humphrey Bogart, and he wore a trench coat. So maybe I'll use that trench coat." And by the time he stepped off the plane in Rome, he had assembled around himself the characteristics that became those of Inspector Clouseau.
In The Pink Panther, Sellers performed everything with superb timing and subtlety, revealing the pathos in the character and underplaying the slapstick.
People forget that the star of The Pink Panther was not Peter Sellers, it was David Niven. But it was Peter Sellers who stole the film, because it was a new kind of performance that Peter was giving. It was a performance based upon physical comedy, not just verbal comedy.
Well, it's like Chaplin. I mean, he created a real character. You can't take it away from him. It's a really original filmic character.
From the moment they met, Peter Sellers and Blake Edwards found an affinity in their love of Chaplin, Keaton, and especially Laurel and Hardy, and they brought out the best in each other. Peter's performance in The Pink Panther was so brilliant that the studio went into production on a sequel even before the first film was released.
Shot in the Dark is always, for me, the best example of Peter Sellers' clowning.
Thank you, monsieur. Tell you, Mr. Ballon, whoever invented that rack should have his head examined.
Yes.
Well, we will continue at another time.
A pleasure at any time.
I suggest you have your architect investigated as well.
The Pink Panther and A Shot in the Dark were huge hits. Overflowing with confidence, Peter was now ready to conquer Hollywood, if not the world.
An English comedy actor off the BBC Home Service, the Goon shows and all those things, suddenly appearing in a major American movie with a great American director, Stanley Kubrick, and I think one felt rather proud.
Fantastic! Oh.
You know. Peter was very fortunate in several of the directors he found, because they worked on the same wavelength as he did. Dick Lester, certainly. Blake Edwards, up to a point. And especially Stanley Kubrick.
10 females to each male.
Peter loved a man who would let him improvise. Peter was absolutely brilliant on the first take. The second take, he was even better.
Oh.
Stanley used to say to me he reaches a kind of ecstasy of comedy.
It looks like we're in a shooting war.
The hell. All the Russians involved, sir?
Dr. Strangelove. Or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and
Love the bomb.
It was an astounding achievement by Sellers. 3 great performances in one film, for which it was assumed he would win an Oscar. But what few know is that he was supposed to play a 4th part in the film, Major Kong, the cowboy soldier who goes down with the bomb. However, the heavy workload, made even tougher by Kubrick's requesting take after take, wore Peter down. He conveniently sustained an ankle injury so he wouldn't have to finish the part, and he was replaced by Slim Pickens. But a more surprising fact about the making of the movie is that it had a different ending.
At the very end, Dr. Strangelove, excited by the idea of world destruction, rising from his wheelchair, raising his arm and saying, "Mein Führer, I can walk." You know, at that point, Stanley cut the film. There was a sequence after that in which the denizens of the war room, the president, his military advisors, the security people, the Russian ambassador, all engage in a custard pie fight.
Where, in other words, the whole thing had been reduced to absurdity, where the nations were fighting with the day's lunch.
When you see the film, you can see the food already laid out on the tables. It's never touched in the film. You wonder why it's there.
They shot this. It went on and on and on, but at the end, when they put it together and had a look at it, Stanley Kubrick wasn't very happy about it, neither was Peter. They just didn't think it worked.
It was cut out of the film for 2 reasons. One was that the physical recognizability of the people was lost because they had so much cream pie sticking to themselves. You couldn't exactly tell who was being hit after a time. The other was that one of the shots showed the president being hit in the face by a cream pie. And I think it's George C. Scott who says, "Gentlemen, our beloved president has been cut down in his prime." And of course, the film had to open after the assassination of Kennedy in Dallas.
Sellers telephoned Spike and told him what had happened and didn't know how to end the film and had he any ideas. And Spike said, "Yeah, just have Vera Lynn singing We'll Meet Again.
Mein Führer, I Can Walk, and then the huge atomic explosions, and Vera Lynn singing a touch of the Goonish songs, We'll Meet Again, don't know where, don't know when.
7 years earlier, as far as the film business was concerned, Peter Sellers was practically unknown. Now, in 1964, he had become the celluloid king of comedy. After a 3-week courtship, he married a 21-year-old Swedish starlet, Britt Ekland. He felt loved, and his friends had never seen him happier. He was about to go to Hollywood to make a film with Billy Wilder, whose sophisticated adult comedy Peter greatly admired. For a brief time, perhaps the only time, everything in his life was in sync, and Peter Sellers was a happy man. It didn't last long. After 6 weeks of shooting Kiss Me Stupid, the working relationship between Sellers and Wilder deteriorated rapidly. Sellers liked to improvise. Wilder was a disciplinarian who insisted the script be performed as written. Arguments between them became fierce and more frequent. But just before disaster could strike on the set, on April 7, 1964, at the age of 38, Peter Sellers died. A massive heart attack stopped Peter's heart for 1.5 minutes. If even a few more seconds had passed before the doctors hooked him up to an external pacemaker, he would have been a vegetable. Still, even after he was stabilized, he suffered 6 more cardiac arrests and then 2 more. But this man who should have died made an amazing recovery. Later, he told friends that a vision of his mother appeared to him and beckoned him back from the grave.
He told me that he wasn't afraid of dying after that. I think obviously it did have something to do with his way of life, with his attitude. It did affect him. I'm not saying he was mental, but it mentally affected him because I noticed this transition in him.
He returned to England, where his condition steadily improved, but the time spent in Los Angeles had left a bitter taste in Peter's mouth. Perhaps unwisely, in an interview with Alexander Walker, he blasted Hollywood. Movie people resented his attitude. He issued an apology, claiming he had been misunderstood, but the damage had been done. Many observers believe his angry outburst cost him the Oscar for Dr. Strangelove. In the fall of 1964, having made a miraculous recovery from a devastating heart attack, Peter Sellers was ready to return to work. The first role of his second life was in a film written for American television by Rod Serling. In this retelling of Dickens' classic A Christmas Carol, Sellers is positively electrifying as a demagogue in a post-apocalyptic world.
Now then, they don't come out in so many words and say that they want to take us over. They're too clever for that. But that's what they want. They want to take over us, individual me. And if we let them seep in here from down yonder on Cross River, if we let these do-gooders, these bleeding hearts, propagate their insidious doctrine of involvement among us, then, my dear friend, my beloved me, we's in trouble. Deep, deep trouble.
Few people have ever seen Carol for Another Christmas, which aired once and vanished. It was thought to be lost, until now. From 1965 to 1970, Sellers appeared in 8 big-budget movies, for which he was paid well over $1 million each. But although his bank balance was going up, the quality of his movies was going down.
Later in his career, Peter made far too many films that didn't do him any good. One of the reasons was that the money was being offered to him. He couldn't refuse it.
The decline of Peter Sellers lasted for 6 years. He made an unbroken string of flops. Critics became indifferent to his work, so did the audience. His fees plummeted. He became unhappy with himself and unhappy with his work. His marriage to Britt dissolved. In the midst of this artistic wasteland, Sellers made 3 films that weren't even released.
Listen, Fairy, do you sell beer here too?
Among other things, yes. Pippi, why don't you go and see how many bottles we've got in our private collection? While I try and keep this young man happy.
A Day at the Beach, written and co-produced by his friend Roman Polanski, was screened once in 1970 and then shelved. Lost for decades, almost no one has seen this film. By 1973, Peter Sellers was box office poison. The one place he could find lucrative work was in commercials.
Hello there! May I be blunt? Flying in the USA, I find it difficult to tell one airline from another.
Hey, when I'm in Europe, I'm happy. Right now I'm flying TWA over Pittsburgh, and I'm still happy. Transworld Airlines brings you Transworld Vacation. Let's go, MacDougall. Lock the door. Hey.
Sinful, that Zabarione, huh?
TWA's Transworld service. It doesn't cost a penny more, and it gives businessmen flying coach the greatest lift since wingtip shoe.
These spots brought in some badly needed cash, but Sellers literally didn't know where his next job was coming from. But, just like his most famous creation, Peter Sellers landed on his feet.
How do you know so much about city ordinances?
What sort of stupid question is that? Are you blind?
Yes.
With both their careers at a low point, Sellers and Blake Edwards decided to team up once again. They made a magnificent return to form with 3 new Pink Panther adventures, all of which attained colossal box office success. Sellers, the has-been, was once again one of the world's highest-paid performers.
Until we meet again and the kiss is sobered.
His comeback was so strong, it couldn't be derailed by a mild heart attack in 1976. Sellers considered having open-heart surgery at this time, but kept putting it off. That indecision would come back to haunt him. Peter married again, this time to Lynn Frederick, and now that he was back on top, he used his clout to set up his dream project.
Peter loved the idea of straight acting. The greater the success as a comedian, the more he yearned for success as an actor. That's why he wanted to make being there so strongly.
I thought that was the best thing he did. And I asked him what made him choose the character. And he said Stan Laurel.
He was very fond of Stan Laurel. And he used to go and visit Stan Laurel whenever he was in Hollywood. And they used to have tea together.
And if you look at him now, you can see it. Just think of Stan Laurel when you watch it.
He had also a gardener called Mr. Dewberry. Now, Mr. Dewberry used to walk very stiff. And Mr. Dewberry used to have an apron on with all his various secateurs and things. Pete said, listen to this. What's going to happen to the garden, he'd say. Mr. Dewberry would say, well, Mr. Sellers, I have to tell you, those over there will die. Those over there will die. But them there, they'll be permanent. Now, when he made being there, that was a mixture of that Stan Laurel and Mr. Dewberry.
For the first time in his life, Peter Sellers was playing a character that was closest to himself. The author of Being There, Jerzy Kosinski, said, Sellers understood my character of Chauncey Gardner better than I, for good reason. He has no interior life, no sense of himself, no notion of what he was or who he would like to become. Being There was Peter's spiritual portrait.
And I wanted to do it very much. I knew it was a supporting role and all that, but I simply wanted to work with Peter in a way that I knew would be probably his greatest performance. I did it just to see a genius at work.
As long as the roots are not severed, all is well, and all will be well in the garden.
In the garden?
Yes. In a garden, growth has its season. First comes spring and summer, but then we have fall and winter. And then we get spring and summer again.
I think what our insightful young friend is saying is that we welcome the inevitable seasons of nature, but we're upset by the seasons of our economy.
Yes, there will be growth in the spring.
I can't imagine many other people taking on a role like that and playing it with such a sort of stillness. And there was something there in the look and the way he held himself, and his marvellous sort of economy of expression, how much he could say by just the slightest movement of the face.
He was absolutely Chauncey. He was vacant, he was this sort of savant, dumb, retarded, yet brilliant person. Simple. He was Chauncey, and I've never worked with an actor who was so completely engulfed in the character.
If you compare it with the other noted performances of that kind of idiot savant, of Forrest Gump and Dustin Hoffman in The Rain Man, less showy and, to me, infinitely more impressive.
A character like that could easily fade, and with it one's interest in the film. But for me it never did. I was on the edge of my seat throughout with what was really a fairly gentle film.
I think he achieved something almost transcendental in that performance.
Being there was the crowning achievement of Sellers' long and arduous creative journey. In this one performance, he utilized every aspect of his genius and was rewarded with superb reviews and an Academy Award nomination. He was crushed when he didn't win. His health was failing rapidly. He was losing weight and becoming frail. At 53, he wasn't old, but he looked old. He and Lynn began spending more and more time at their chalet in Switzerland. Sellers was developing new films that promised to make him wealthy beyond all measure. Romance of the Pink Panther, that he was co-writing, and a remake of a Preston Sturges film. Typically, Sellers became restless and bored waiting for these to come to fruition. Barclays Bank came to the rescue by offering him £1 million to make a series of television commercials. The money was too good to pass up, so Sellers threw himself into the creation of a new character.
Allow me to assist you in your predicament. Been on the fiddle, have we? That happens to be my very first pay packet. We wasn't exactly paid with a note, was we, Maestro? Thank you very much. Who are you? Monty, your new manager. Casino's the name, money's the game.
What was you doing back there? I'm looking for rooms. Clean, comfortable, inexpensive.
Ah, it's uncanny. You read my mind. It's stage of view, you know. There's only one left. 100 knicker down and 25 large ones a week.
Is it much further?
Further? This is it.
Anything to do with money, ask Barclays first.
These commercials would be the last time Peter Sellers ever appeared on film.
He had this sudden attack of where he said, I don't have a heart. He said, I have a pacemaker, and I think it's going into 5th gear. Could you get a doctor?
Sellers had postponed doing anything about his chronic heart trouble, but this latest attack convinced him he must deal with it once and for all. He made plans to fly to Los Angeles for tests in preparation for open-heart surgery. But first, he stopped in London for a reunion with old friends.
I got a message from Spike Mulligan saying, let's go and have dinner with Peter Sellers. Before one of us is walking behind the coffin, let's have dinner together.
I didn't think Peter was going to die at that time. I thought that it happened so often that he would probably get through it again.
I was sitting in my living room here in Malibu with some friends. And we were talking about something, and all of a sudden, I had this chill go through me, and I thought of Peter, and I thought, my Lord, he feels like he's here in the room with me. I didn't know why all this went truly physically through my body. The phone rang, it was a journalist, and said, your friend Peter Sellers has just died. Do you have any comment? And I felt, my God.
We never had dinner together. Very sad, that.
And that was the end of an era, you know. But they can't take away all the great years and the fun we have.
There are so many scripts that I know that do the rounds. If only Peter Sellers was alive. This is absolutely right for him.
Oh, Peter's legacy is as a wonderful entertainer, a unique entertainer. A person who could play comedy, but give it a humanity.
If genius means someone being able to do something which no one else can do, and do it superbly, then Sellers probably was a genius, because he was able to act comedy. I mean, act well and play comedy in such a way that I really don't think anyone else before or since has done it as well.
The best way that any comic would want is that people watched him and laughed. Full stop.
On screen, on stage, he could do it. Off, he was a different man, but he was my pal, and I loved him.
I miss the funny voices he did, because he'd do them at a drop of a hat. He'd become somebody completely different in a nanosecond, and that was the great thing about him. Lovely man he was. I'm very fond of him.
On the day he died, many voices were silenced forever. The beloved goon characters, the defective French detective, and Chance the gardener amongst them. Looking back at his remarkable career, it's hard to argue with those who believe Peter Sellers could indeed walk on water.
It's very good, very good.